The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martyn Lewis and Debbie Thrower.
Thousands walk out in the postal dispute, but the talks will go on tomorrow.
The legacy of Hungerford's semi-automatic weapons are to be banned by the government.
Labour's Jack Ashley reveals a catalogue of alleged army brutality.
The Soviets arrive in Washington, but there's a sour note before the summit.
And Prince Charles blitz on the architects. The planning minister says, "I agree." Good evening. Postal workers in key sorting offices walked out on strike today without waiting for the result of last-ditch talks to try and avoid the threat to the Christmas mail. But those talks, which lasted for 8 hours, are now to continue tomorrow. And the union leader, Alan Tuffin, said he was asking the strikers to go back to work, and he expected them to obey. In a joint statement, the Post Office chairman, Sir Brian Nicholson, and Mr Tuffin said, "A virtual breakdown has been averted, at least temporarily, because the two parties are still in discussion. We have agreed there is no further comment to be made at this stage." The union wants a 3-hour cut in the working week. The management is offering 1 hour linked to improved productivity. The Post Office earlier said it expected 4,500 men from Brighton to Glasgow to be on 24-hour strike by midnight tonight. And in southeast London, plans are already underway to seal post boxes from tomorrow to prevent a backlog building up.
The post workers' leaders had arrived this morning expecting the meeting to get nowhere, especially as the Post Office chairman ruled out arbitration. At lunchtime, workers in Glasgow, in a pre-planned move, walked out when it emerged that formal negotiations had broken down. They were joined in a 24-hour strike by workers at Southend in Essex, which is the main centre for access credit cards and customs and excise. By tonight, 4,500 postal staff were already taking action or about to, in Glasgow, Southend, London and Brighton. But throughout the afternoon and early evening, despite the breakdown and the strikes, both sides held talks about talks, and the Post Office chairman emerged to announce limited progress.
A virtual breakdown has been averted, at least temporarily, because the two parties are still in discussion. The talks have been adjourned until tomorrow. There's been some limited industrial action today, and every effort is being made to get the staff back to work whilst talks continue.
We're still some way off of avoiding either a breakdown or an agreement. That's why we're coming back tomorrow morning.
So the talks are still alive, if only just. However, having been to the brink, both sides will be resuming full negotiations tomorrow, and there may be scope for the Post Office to review its offer on working hours. However, there's still a very big gap between them. But the Christmas mail has already been disrupted, and both the unions and the management now know what the price of failure will be.
At the moment, the Post Office has a monopoly on mail costing under £1, but the government has indicated it may review that situation if a dispute proves too disruptive. Private companies already carry parcels, and they're now gearing themselves up to handle even more work.
They were busy unpacking their own post boxes today at the private firm of Postplan. Next week, they'll go into newsagents and sweet shops in London to take local letters. But it'll still cost £1 a time unless the Post Office's monopoly on letter traffic is first lifted. 2-year-old Postplan is one of the biggest of the private agencies hoping to step up business during the Post Office dispute. It even has its own stamps. Today it reported a big increase in inquiries as industrial action grew more likely. But there are limits to what even a company which handles 30,000 packages a day can offer.
We're not going to be foolish and say that we could take over from the Post Office. We'd be fools to say that. We could quadruple, certainly, what we currently do. And we don't want to let people down, so we will have to tell people that if we reach 121,000, that will have to go in the following day's mail.
Alternatives to the Royal Mail have grown. Facsimile machines are widely available, and the Post Office has lost its monopoly of parcels. It faces growing competition, notably from TNT, the big international transport company in which Rupert Murdoch has a big stake. Its vehicles help break the printing unions at Wapping. Now another union dispute could bring fresh opportunities. TNT's international letter service is linked up with foreign postal services. It's planning home deliveries if the post office's monopoly is relaxed.
We have in fact made arrangements for several thousand people to be engaged to provide a delivery service of letters in this country should the post office monopoly be relaxed.
The big question, of course, about any transfer of mail from the post office to private services is the sheer scale of the operation. A company like this will do something like 1 million letters in a week. The post office at Christmas will handle 100 times that in a single day.
Charity organisations are warning tonight that a major dispute would have a disastrous effect on their finances. Charity Christmas card sales are expected to bring in £1 million in the next couple of weeks, and they fear the threat of strike action will deter people from buying them.
If there's an all-out strike, it will be catastrophic. A selective strike will be extremely damaging. A lot of donations are finding their way to charities at this time. This will go missing. I don't care what the post office says, it happens. Charities will find themselves suddenly strapped for cash, especially the smaller charities. Point two, the public will panic, I suspect. They won't want to post their Christmas cards. They'll sit on them. They won't buy next year. This will be a loss of a potential loss of up to £30 million turnover.
The gun laws are to be changed to ban the type of weapon used by the Hungerford killer Michael Ryan. Government proposals published today will outlaw semi-automatic weapons, and there'll be tighter controls on shotguns. Some shooting enthusiasts have said the government has overreacted to the Hungerford tragedy, but the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd told Parliament effective control over lethal weapons was a small price to pay for safeguarding the community. Welcoming the changes, Labour's Deputy Leader Roy Hattersley said tighter controls on shotguns were absolutely essential in this country.
This is the type of semi-automatic rifle that Michael Ryan used to bring death and terror to the streets of Hungerford. It's capable of firing 18 rounds in just 4 seconds. Under the government's proposals, the Kalashnikov is just one of a number of semi-automatic guns which will become prohibited weapons. It's thought that up to 8,000 people have pump-action and burst-fire weapons like these. Legal today, but set to be outlawed within months. And there'll be tougher controls on Britain's 1 million shotgun owners. The police will need to be given a good reason by anyone wanting to own one, and it will have to be kept in a secure place, like the safe used by this Hove pensioner who keeps 2 Smith & Wesson revolvers for use at his local gun club. Other proposed reforms include the restriction of ammunition sales to those who can produce a valid certificate, much stricter control of converted military weapons, and restrictions on the right of overseas visitors to buy shotguns without a licence. But will all this be enough to prevent another Hungerford?
No, you can never guarantee against the chap who's quiet, law-abiding, fills in every form, obeys every law until the moment when he goes berserk. You can't guarantee that, and against that, and I wouldn't pretend to. What we will do is to make it less likely that guns will get into the wrong hands, less likely that certificates will be issued to people who shouldn't have them.
Principally, most importantly, there's going to be a much tougher control of shotguns. And that's absolutely essential in this country. I feared a month ago the government wouldn't do that because of the shotgun lobby. But I'm pleased to say that the Home Secretary has accepted the pressure that we brought upon him, and shotguns will be in far tighter control than they have been in the past.
There's also to be a firearms amnesty next year in the hope of taking thousands of illegally held guns out of circulation. The last one in 1968 brought in 25,000 weapons.
A catalogue of alleged army brutality has been unveiled tonight by the Labour MP Jack Ashley. He says he's received more than 120 letters, some of them anonymous, from soldiers or their families describing acts of brutality in Britain's army camps. Mr Ashley is campaigning for an independent inquiry into complaints of bullying.
Last month, an entire battalion of Coldstream Guards was confined to barracks while allegations of bullying were investigated. And a few days later, 3 soldiers of the King's Own Scottish Borderers were convicted of common assault. Jack Ashley says that letters he's received from soldiers or their parents have convinced him that bullying and brutality is rife in the British Army. He said that in the House of Commons tomorrow he'll name a commanding officer whose alleged lack of compassion has ruined careers and marriages among his men. And he quoted a letter which said that initiation ceremonies in the Queen's Dragoon Guards ritualised drinking, according to the soldier who wrote to him, stripped young officers of any leadership to which they might have aspired.
I think it's a major problem in the British Army, bullying and brutality, and I'm astounded that the Minister for Defence can reject the idea of an ombudsman, because I've had over 70 letters in the last few weeks alone outlining some appalling brutality and bullying, and it clearly goes on a large scale. For the Minister to say that we don't allow bullying in the British Army is nonsense. Bullying isn't only allowed, it is condoned. And the only way of resolving this is with an independent, impartial ombudsman.
There are examples, and I regret them. Both Jack Ashley and I want to solve the problem. The right way to do it is by reinforcing the tried existing system within the British Army, and not by scrapping it and replacing it with an ombudsman, because that would go right to the heart of the tried and tested system in the British Army, where the officer has the responsibility for the well-being of the men in his unit, and the soldier knows that he can, and indeed should, raise all questions of bullying, all allegations of bullying, with his NCO and with his commanding officer.
But one of the principal complaints he's read to us today has been about such a commanding officer.
Well, Jack Ashley should write to me. If he raises it in the House of Commons, of course I will respond.
With less than a week to go before the Washington summit, two new arguments have broken out between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Russians have accused the Americans of withholding vital information and hampering completion of the treaty scrapping intermediate-range nuclear weapons. The United States has accused the Soviet Union of breaking a treaty on anti-ballistic missiles signed 15 years ago. The Soviet delegation to the summit has already begun arriving in Washington, and they've taken an early lead in the propaganda war.
The advanced Soviet party has landed and walked straight into controversy. This was day one of their summit publicity drive. The first subject, new allegations from the White House that they'd violated the ABM treaty. They denied it.
I have to say that we are surprised by this move.
Мы считали и считаем, что лучше проверить на месте, как обстоят дела.
Because we believed, and we do believe now, that it's better to see on site, during an on-site inspection, where we stand.
But the allegations were not to get in the way of what the Russians called the chance for new dialogue, and they've been working on that for some time. Long before the summit date was set, Russia's chief salesman has been out across America, flying a new kind of flag.
I was introduced as sitting to the right of the speaker, which is a bit of an exaggeration. I'm actually on the far left.
Vladimir Posner has gone down well in America, a Soviet commentator, but one charged with improving Russia's image in the West. He's a part of the largest and most sophisticated propaganda drive his country has ever mounted.
And I want to ask you, do I look like a Russian? And do I sound like a Russian? So as far as I know, Russians are supposed to be fat and squat and threatening looking. And they have very strong, Russian accent when they speak.
Posner's latest American tour lasted 2 months and took him mainly to colleges and schools. He was pleased with the results.
I found that while initially they are, if not hostile, certainly very suspicious, you do get through. You can get through.
And someone else got through. Mr. Gorbachev's interview, shown on Monday night, was pushed into third place on the ratings by a football game, but it still touched some raw nerves. So effectively has the Russian message been getting through that Mr. Reagan's decided to do something about it. Tomorrow he'll be giving his own interview to American television to match that of Mr. Gorbachev. The competition is on every level. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in Washington.
The two countries most directly affected by the deal on nuclear weapons are East and West Germany. They both welcomed the agreement. The West German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, said today it could mark a turning point in East-West relations. The American weapons which will be scrapped in West Germany are 64 cruise missiles and 108 Pershing IIs. There are also 72 Pershing 1As, which are West German but have American nuclear warheads. In East Germany, up to 48 Soviet SS-23s and SS-12Ms will go. Our diplomatic editor John Simpson has been to the small East German town of Oosterwijk. It's just 2 miles from West Germany, and this is the first time the communist authorities have allowed Western cameras so close to the border.
You couldn't exactly call Oosterwijk lively. It's 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but the church, which in other parts of East Germany often serves as a centre of opposition to the state, is empty here. So are the streets, apart from the village Christmas tree, put up for purely social reasons, someone said, and the occasional Trabant car wheezing asthmatically through the streets. It can take 10 years to get a Trabant, and while they're waiting, people tend to improvise. And yet there is life in Oosterwijk all the same, plenty of it. At the local youth club, they're dancing to British pop music. Get fresh at the weekend, the song says, and Oosterwijk's team of disco dancers seems ready to do precisely that, under the quizzical gaze of the country's leader, Erich Honecker. All the interviews we did in Oosterwijk were fixed for us by the authorities, but people did seem genuinely pleased at the prospect of a summit meeting which should rid East and West Germany of nuclear weapons.
Dieses Treffen bedeutet für mich und für mein weiteres Leben.
This summit means a lot to me. I'd like to have a family one day, and I'd like my children to live in a safe world.
The authorities were particularly keen to show us Oosterwijk's old people's home, where the elderly can live in cheap and relatively cheerful surroundings. Sunday lunch is a serious affair, and as they eat, Christmas music plays on the gramophone. These people have lived through 2 world wars, and they've watched their part of Germany change from Nazism to communism. Mr. Honecker, who's here as well, isn't enthusiastic about a lot of the ideas coming from Moscow at present, but he does strongly support the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from both parts of Germany.
Human beings and the people of this country are worried by the existence of nuclear weapons, and it would be a great relief if they were destroyed.
And indeed, in this village, which was once wealthy and is now a rather drab sort of place, the prospect of an arms agreement does genuinely seem to have cheered people up. And more than one of them pointed proudly to a Latin tag on one of the houses: "Agreement makes small things grow." This is John Simpson for the 9 o'clock news in Oosterwijk, East Germany.
In Zimbabwe, the funeral has taken place of 16 white people who were massacred by black rebels last week. The 13 Zimbabweans, 2 Americans and 1 Briton, including a 6-week-old baby, were cremated after a memorial service in Bulawayo. Last week's massacre took place at 2 farms in Matabeleland. The Zimbabwe government has blamed it on squatters who were involved in a land dispute with the missionaries.
The people of Bulawayo, filling their city hall to mourn, had hoped the years of savage violence in Matabeleland were drawing to a close. The government is allowing the local office of Joshua Nkomo's supporters to reopen, a gesture to a largely defeated political force. But violence, political or no, runs on. The born-again Christians who refused to defend themselves on isolated farms were easy targets for brutal murder. The local community of reconciliation all but destroyed, those who remain pledged themselves to continue the work, whatever the odds. After the service, relatives and friends were keen to talk to us. Trevor Davenport helped found the community.
It's quite understandable.